Welcome back to another tutorial video for Magicka Mayhem. This is Ken Erickson. In our last video, we covered the basic kind of straightforward Spellmageddon gameplay rules. If you haven't watched that, I'd recommend you watch that first. It's really where everybody should start. It makes it really easy to kind of get up and running with the game, see kind of what it was that we really envisioned initially for the game to be pretty casual, a little bit of strategy, but a lot of silliness and fun. But if you're not really into the casual silliness, type stuff, and you want more of the strategy, you can actually go a lot deeper with this next gameplay mode that we're calling Spell versus Spell. We're calling it Spell versus Spell because you can actually use a spell to disrupt another spell. And a lot of times these spells will be called snap spells. So you don't just have to just sit back and just take a spell coming at you and hope you get a Mayhem card to block it. You can actually do something about it. You can actually create a snap spell and then direct that at the spell coming at you, and you might be able to reflect it back at the wizard that sent it your way, which is a lot of fun. Or you might be able to disrupt it, or you might be able to make it just kind of blow up, and maybe it kind of hits both of you, but it still doesn't make you have the full effect. So you get a little bit kind of half and half. So there's some nice deep strategic elements to that, which you can also then ramp up or down with how much mayhem you do, which we discussed as well in the last video. So let's get into spell versus spell. So there's a little bit more involved, but it's really not that complicated. Once you play a couple games, like 1 or 2 games, with these rules, after you've kind of gotten a good handle on Spellmageddon, then I think you'll have it down pretty well. Anyway, so spell versus spell in many ways is similar to the simple, more straightforward Spellmageddon that we already talked about. As such, it is highly recommended that you play a few games of Spellmageddon before plunging headlong into spell versus spell. Spell counter spell. Unlike Spellmageddon, in spell versus spell, a wizard gains the ability to counter, disrupt, or reflect spells as they happen. That's huge. You can't do that in Spellmageddon. You can counter, disrupt, or reflect spells. Mastery of spell versus spell gameplay requires an understanding of opposing elements. And in nature, certain elements do not mix well, right? So we have lightning and earth are opposing elements. You have fire and cold are opposing elements. You have life and arcane are opposing elements. You're generally not going to see those opposing elements show up in the same spell. Well, if you're casting a spell that contains one of these elements, then it might make sense to then have to then counter that spell, right? Spell, counter spell, to counter that spell with a snap spell containing the opposite element. And that might create some cool effects that can disrupt what that wizard had in store for you, and hopefully kind of turn the tables on him, which makes it a lot of fun. And then I want to say too, Ethan kind of likened this to like a tennis match, where it's kind of a back and forth. It's a volley. You hit the ball this way, hit the ball that way, hit the ball this way. Oh, we just missed. It's kind of a back and forth that makes it a lot of fun and kind of a fast moving game and pretty strategic as well. All right, so a counter spell, you have different kinds of spells. You have a counter spell, disrupt spell, and a reflect spell. And this is really where once you get this down, you've got it all down. But sometimes keeping this straight can be a little off. That's why we have a quick reference for the snap spells, and we also have these cards with the rules on them. So once you play this, just set a couple of these cards off to the side. You can refer to it. You don't have to pull out the big book and look through it. You can just have this card right next to you. You can look at it real quick to make sure you're playing it right. So a counter spell is real straightforward. It's when you have an opposing element snap spell. So when elements of an incoming spell are opposed, the spell explodes. So if you have a spell coming in that has 2 lightning in it, and you oppose it with 2 earth, like we talked about in just a second ago, then the spell, there are 2 opposing elements. They don't want to be together. You force them together, they blow up. And they blow up in both of your faces. And what you find is the casting wizard and the target wizard experiences all spell effects and half of the spell damage. So whatever the effect, if it's like a frozen effect, both of you are frozen. And if it's supposed to be 4 damage, you'll both get half damage. And then so it kind of splits it between the 2 of them. And if you actually go forward in the rules here, we kind of show this a little bit as well. So you have your counter. Remember, we're talking counter, disruption, and reflect. We're talking about a counter spell. So we have here, look at this. It's a 2 fire spell. This is a firebolt. It's got 2 fire and it's got 1 lightning. You counter that with 2 cold. It's a 2 cold snap spell called a cold cube. When you counter that spell, it'll blow up in both of your faces. The casting wizard and the target wizard suffer the spell effect, and both wizards take half damage. So in this case, it's 2 damage, it's 1 damage to each of you. But it's better than than the original target taking 2 damage. So it's not the best way to go about it, but if you have the elements for it, this is something you might want to consider. Now let's go back to where we were before, and you'll see that we have the next one is the disrupt spell. So it's very similar. It's a like element snap spell. So this one's an opposing element, lightning and earth, right? But in this case, it's actually the same element. It's a like element. So the spell is disrupted because it's like kind of like they have where the same sides of a magnet oppose one another, right? The same polarity will oppose one another. Same thing. If you send a spell with lightning in it, add a spell with lightning in it, they're going to want to push each other apart. So the spell is actually disrupted when it is struck by a snap spell that contains the same two elements that are also contained in the spell. A disrupted spell fails with no effect. It just basically just poof, disappears. You discard the spell card, you discard the elements, you discard the snap spell elements, and then it's like nothing ever happened. So if we go to this example over here again, you'll see that we have, unlike the counter where it's opposite, we have it's the same. So this firebolt spell has 2 fire and 1 lightning, and we're disrupting it with a 2 fire flickering flame snap spell. So that disrupts the spell, causing it to fail rather unspectacularly, and it does not cause any damage. No effect, no damage, no nothing. It's like it never existed. It just disappears. You disrupted it. All right, that's a great, obviously a great strategy as well when you have that. So you have a couple options. You have a number of cards in your hand, and you have to decide which one of these you want to go with. Or if you want to do anything, maybe you want the spell to take effect and you want to save those elements for a more powerful spell down the road, which hopefully your opponent won't disrupt. So there's definitely some strategy involved there. Next up is then a reflect spell. And a reflect spell is basically a counter spell, an opposing snap spell, plus a shield. So if you add a shield to it, it becomes a reflector. So it's going to basically bounce it, but instead of all of the damage exploding in all directions to where both wizards get injured, it actually will reflect all of that damage back to the casting wizard. So when a counter spell is combined with a shield element, counter spell, opposing elements, right, plus a shield element, the incoming spell is reflected back to the original caster. The casting wizard experiences all spell effects and full spell damage. The target wizard experiences no effect, like nothing ever happened. So this is the best one. If you can do this one, that's like amazing, because then the other wizard thought he was going to get you, but didn't. He was able to. That actually got bounced back to the attacking wizard. So again, you can pick and choose when you do these. Sometimes you may not want to bounce back something when it's not a very powerful spell, but you bounce back a powerful spell, you've got yourself a good strategy kind of going. So you got to pick and choose your battle when you do this, especially because shield elements are limited. There aren't that many of them in the game. So you might want to use those for a summoning spell, because summoning spells tend to require shield elements, or sometimes you want to use them for these really powerful reflect spells. But if you use them all up at the very beginning of the game, you might find your opponents starting to destroy you using those shields a little bit more wisely. So something to keep in mind. But that's kind of the main difference between Spellmageddon and Spell versus Spell. And again, we'll go through the snap spell reference. This is one of the cards, a couple of the cards you have already in your game, so you put this off to the side and refer to it whenever you like to. We're going to go over some of these other effects as well. I think we'll do that in just a second. I think I better do those now. Yeah, because we haven't talked about these too much. So Baby Boulder, very simple one. It's actually 2 earth, causes 1 damage. Nothing spectacular about that. Very simple, very boring snap spell. But of course, it opposes lightning, so you can use it to counter, disrupt, or reflect some kind of lightning spell. That's pretty straightforward in there. Now I'll skip Static Stunner for the moment. Let's go on to Arcane Arc. Arcane Arc is very similar to the Baby Boulder. It's 2 arcane. It causes 1 damage. Nothing spectacular except in the way that it operates with counter, disrupt, and reflect. And we've also then we'll go back then. So now we'll go to the. Let's see. Probably the best one is to skip ahead to would be a Wet Willy. So the Wet Willy is actually 2 water. That's interesting. This one doesn't cause any damage, and it doesn't have an opposing element. So you can't really use a Wet Willy to disrupt, right, or counter or reflect a spell, because there are no spells that are opposing water. But what it does do is it actually wets a target. So if you actually wet a wizard, you just do a Wet Willy snap spell, no damage, 0 damage whatsoever. But now that wizard is wet until they are either dried, frozen, or zapped, right? So then there's basically 3 things to do. They'll stay wet. They're going to stay wet for the whole game until something else happens to them. And if you hit them then with a cold cube, which is too cold, it also does not cause any damage at all, no damage. But what it will do is it'll freeze a wet target for 1 turn. So when I say target, it could be a wizard or it could be a summoned creature as well. So you wet them first, no damage, and then you can cold cube them, and then they will actually be frozen for 1 turn. So it's pretty powerful. You can also wet them, and then you can hit them with a static stunner. Now what's interesting about this is the static stunner by itself causes 1 damage. So a dry wizard can be hit for 1 damage with a static stunner, but a wet wizard who is then hit with a static stunner will then be zapped for 2 damage. So it doubles that. And there's some spells there too where if it's a spell card spell containing lightning and that wizard is wet beforehand, it can really do some serious damage. So you may want to combine your Wet Willy with one of those spell card spells rather than just sticking with a Wet Willy and then a static stunner and only getting 1 extra damage. So keep that in mind. But those are very powerful. When you have a wet wizard, you can do some pretty cool stuff. The third thing you do with the wet wizard is freezing, zapping, and then is also dry them. So you wouldn't want to necessarily dry your opponent. You want your opponent to be wet so you can zap them or you can freeze them. But let's say you get wet by an opponent wizard, then you might want to dry yourself. So right here, the flickering flame normally would cause 1 damage to an opponent wizard, but if you cast it at a wet wizard, it will dry the wizard and it doesn't cause any damage. So it dries the wet wizard is now dry and it didn't hurt them at all. So you can literally cast this on yourself, or you can cast it on an ally, or you can cast it on a summoned creature that had gotten wet. And because it's a snap spell, you can do it right away. You don't have to wait till a turn that comes up. Snap spells can happen instantaneously. So something to kind of keep in mind. So if you're a little too slow in the draw, you might find that your opponents can take advantage of that. So watch for that. So I covered all the snap spells on this one. So, and we talked in previous videos about the shoddy shields and the vitality tonics. I'll just mention very quickly. These are snap spells as well, and you cast them by doing two shield elements will create a barrier that can protect you from 2 damage, and you can actually up that shield. You can look more into that elsewhere. I won't cover that too much in this video. Same thing with the vitality tonic, except when you combine 2 life, it'll heal for 1 damage, and you can increase that as well by adding more life to it. So we're going on just a little bit more to just make sure you understand exactly how these work. So in the spell versus spell, only spell card spells can be countered, disrupted, or reflected. So don't try to use a snap spell against a snap spell. We actually tried having that in the rules at one time, and it became a little too hard to keep track of and a little bit of a spaghetti nightmare when you're playing. So I would encourage you not to make that one of your house rules either. So only spell card spells can be countered, disrupted, or reflected. And they must also contain 2 or more of the same element. So for instance, we have a firebolt here. The firebolt has 2 fire in it. You know, it can be countered, it can be disrupted, it can be reflected. However, you have this one over here. This is a Fury of the Wizard. It has 1 cold, it has 1 lightning, it has 1 arcane, and it has 1 shield. It does not have 2 of anything in it. Therefore, it cannot be countered, it cannot be disrupted, it cannot be reflected. So keep that in mind. In the Fury of the Wizard you wouldn't want to counter that one kind of anyway. And it's got some funny stuff too. You'll see as you play the game. That's a fun one. And then a reflected spell acts like any other spell, only it's heading in the wrong direction. Therefore, a reflected spell can also be countered, disrupted, or reflected again by a new target wizard, like a game of Magicka tennis. All right, I have to say that one again because it seems that kind of confuses people. It kind of confused me even when we were writing it together. So once you have a spell and you've reflected the spell, I'm casting it at you, and then you all of a sudden you reflect it right back to me. The spell's coming right back at me. I could just sit there and just take it, or may have it go through the mayhem roll first before it hits me. Or if I have the snap spell ability to do it, I can actually disrupt it, or I can counter it, or I can reflect it back to you again, and you can kind of go back and forth like a game of tennis. But that's really only happens with reflected spells. If the spell was countered, it blows up. You can't counter a blown up spell. If it was disrupted, it disappears. You can't counter a disappearing spell. You can only counter, disrupt, or reflect a reflected spell. So I hope that makes sense. But that's kind of fun when it gets reflected back. It's not, and because reflecting is such a powerful snap spell, it only makes sense that there would be a powerful consequence to that as well, having it reflected back at you again by the another wizard. So countered spell, caster and target both draw mayhem cards. So let's go back here. So we have the counter spell. When a counter spell has been countered, it explodes in both your faces, and you're both supposed to take 1 damage. But what ends up happening is you actually don't know if you take damage yet because you both have to draw mayhem cards. So I should actually say you would then roll. It actually has to, I should probably say here, it has to pass mayhem muster. So you'll each flip a coin or roll a die, whichever you choose, to see what happens to that damage that's going towards both of you. So it's quite possible that the spell can then be changed again by that. So that's where it gets really kind of crazy and silly and a lot of fun, very unpredictable. You have no two games will be ever the same when you play Magicka Mayhem. A reflected spell, well, only the new target will draw a mayhem card. So when you reflect it back, and that person doesn't then, that wizard doesn't then reflect, doesn't do anything to it, before it strikes them, they get to do a mayhem muster roll or a mayhem muster flip to see if a mayhem card is pulled for it. And a disrupted spell is failed. Therefore, once it's failed, nothing happens. You can't do a mayhem card for something that failed. It's a 0 effect. So what do? Double the effect or make the effect by half? You can't, because it doesn't exist. It was completely disrupted. So I'm going to repeat that again because I want to make sure you totally understand that. So if you have disrupted a spell, it fails. There's no mayhem card draw at all. If you reflect a spell, this one I think makes pretty good sense. If you reflect a spell, before that spell hits its intended target, no matter how many times, maybe it gets reflected 5 times. It's reflected back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. By the time it finally hits its eventual target, that target gets to do a mayhem roll to see if a mayhem card is drawn. The one that can be a little confusing is the countered spell, because the countered spell blew up. Let's say it's a 4 damage spell, and it blows up because it was countered, and now 2 damage is flying at one wizard, 2 damage is flying at the other wizard. Both of them get to do a mayhem roll. It has to pass mayhem muster to see. Maybe this 2 damage will end up becoming 4 and end up hitting that target. Maybe this other 2 damage over here will end up becoming 0 damage going to the other target. So it can get kind of crazy, but you have to include those mayhem cards when you're doing that. Assuming then if you're doing maximum mayhem, then you do it for every single possible effect before it hits the wizard. So, and then we already kind of went over this one a little bit, but this is actually a good reference card to have when you're first playing spell versus spell. So you can have your snap spell reference by itself sitting next to you when you're playing, and you can also then have this one as well, because it shows you how the counters work, how the disrupts work, and how the reflex work. Once you've played it a few turns, maybe a game or so, you'll pretty much have figured it out. So I hope this helps you understand how spell versus spell works, and have a lot of fun with that if you're really interested in kind of that more strategic gameplay. And it's really a hoot when you get going. So we like this one a great deal. It's really not that complicated once you've played it a couple times, and I think in some regards it's more mayhem-y even than the way we've had it set up with the mayhem cards in Spellmageddon. So enjoy, have a great time, and if you ever find some house rules that you like, that you enjoy even better than what we've created for you, feel free to send them over to us. And our emails are on the website, and we'll be happy to incorporate those into future game rules and give you credit for that as well. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed the video.